Speaking of the river, we have Grand Rapids Whitewater update is next, and I think we've invited Steve Heacock to give us a update of where we are. Steve, are you on?
I sure am. Yep. Thank you, Chairman Wynn, or is it Dragon Boat Captain Wynn? Maybe. But delighted to be here, and actually it was great to hear the other presentations, most of which, of course, are about the river in some way or another, and maybe that's the emphasis we need for this last presentation. We are going to trim this down. I promise. We'll get done in the time allotted because most of you are well acquainted with this project. What I want to get done today is two things. One, to make certain it's still top of mind for you. And secondly, give you an update on where we are and what's going on with the project. And I think I can do that rather quickly. To set the stage, though, and first of all, Amanda, thanks for your help last night and this morning. Could you go to the next slide, please? And the next one. Next slide, please. So just to set the stage, next slide, please. Again, I'm going to fly through these, Amanda. So just imagine, close your eyes for a second. Imagine standing next to an active stream that has rapids in it and feel that mist and hear the sound that's coming from the river and how that makes you feel. It's like the feel when you walk through a stand of pines or when you reach a vista on a mountainside or when you're on the top of a ski hill. It is a phenomenal feeling that's enriching and renews us as human beings, and I think brings us back to the core, our connection to nature, that meaningful tie that we have to the earth that binds us, and that really is what we're getting done here. There was a time when people found Grand Rapids by sound. They were a mile away in the woods. They started hearing the rapids, and they would find their way to the center of the village by that sound. And we mean to recapture that sound and that feel. Brian said earlier that public art's crucial to this town. This, in a sense, as Dale was saying, this is all art in a sense. I mean, because it brings in, it accentuates, it hones in your senses and your feelings and your basic nature, I think, and so that's at its core what we're trying to get done here. Yeah, let's go to the next slide, Amanda. Next slide, please. The project goals. You can see them there. I'm not going to read them to you, but I do want to describe this in a little different way. Next slide, please. Next slide. We've been struggling with Eagle a little bit, and I'll talk about that. And in part, it's in how you describe the project and what it is we're doing. It's really not that hard, even though it is tremendously hard in its own right and very complicated and complex. I've kiddingly said that with the CAA, we had to move 2 courtrooms, we had to move a police station, we had to take down a relatively new parking structure and build a new convention center, and that all seems simple compared to this, in part because we're taking a natural amenity and making changes to it. So it makes everybody nervous, in part because the agency we're working with is, relatively fresh off of the Flint crisis and other things that have made them a little timid about innovative projects. So, but in effect, what we're doing is removing those 4 low-head dams that were put in there in the 1920s. And they are dangerous. They create whitewater that creates an unmanageable churn, meaning that if you went over it in a canoe or a kayak and turned sideways, which is what you would inevitably do, you cannot get out of it, no matter how strong you are as a kayaker. And it's why most of us are not in the river. And in fact, you don't see a lot of people in the river. And every now and then you'll see some brave or silly soul go through, but it really is not a place you can be safely. They're also impassable for non-jumping fish at most flows that we have during the summertime, which means, of course, that the things like walleye and bass and suckers and sturgeon cannot get to natural spawning grounds, cannot get where they normally would get to create a good fishery. The second thing we're doing is repairing the bed of the river. So it's been stripped. It was purposefully stripped. There were state laws that said, let's go spend money on getting the rocks out of the river, because the attempt at that time was to create a better port. Everything then was about making Grand Rapids a better commercial port. So all that rock and gravel was stripped. It's now basically it is not this, but it's basically like a concrete chute that you might see for a sewer system. And it's not good fish and mussel habitat. Next slide, please, Amanda. So what are we doing? We're replacing those dams with 4 natural rock and gravel structures. 75% of it is riffle habitat, meaning it's just rock sticking out of the water and natural structure that exists. And then about a quarter of it is going to be the whitewater amenity that we're talking about. Very small part of the project are those recreational features, even though they're incredibly important, obviously, for the economic development and the recreational use. Those rock structures that we are going to build include a wave that'll be up to 2 feet high, that range in width from 35 to 140 feet, depending on flow. Keep in mind the river's 400 to 500 feet wide. So those waves, why are they important? What do they mean? They have suitable hydraulics for experienced boaters. They avoid these keeper hydraulics, that churn that we talked about, that the low-head dams do. In fact, they spit you out into a slow and deep recovery pool right downstream. So if you do what I will inevitably do and flip over, you're in this quiet pool then where you can gather yourself. There's also river egress on the shore, and Dale's project will provide an important one of those where people can get out if in fact they need to do so. And those waves will be passable by strong swimming fish species. So not only can fish get past on the riffle part, but they can also get through these waves. So again, remember, it's replacing a river-wide band of concrete that's over 1.5 feet high. And the design of them is very important. Eagle is challenging us on, why are you building these? And they use the term artificial structures. And we're going, yeah, well, we want them engineered because it makes them safer. If you just threw rocks in the river and allowed whitewater to occur where it might, you might end up in deep water, you might end up next to a flood wall, you might end up under the bridges. By designing them, we make the choices on where they go and how it happens. So that's the point I wanted to make, and I think we can flip forward, Amanda, to about slide 15. Yeah, go another one, Amanda. And then Matt Chapman is with me as well. And he's going to speak to the design and some of the other pieces of the project. But I did include these experts from Al Vanderberg, our friend in Ottawa County, the administrator there, just to make the point that, by the way, this project doesn't just benefit downtown. It benefits downtown greatly. But the truth is, as Al notes, fish, mussels, insects, they don't recognize county lines. So the ecological improvements we make are gonna benefit everything downstream, all through Kent County and then into Ottawa County, all the way to Lake Michigan. So all of those benefits are there, not just environmentally, but economically. The truth is, people are going to put in boats up near Ann Street to start this run. Many people will want to get out and go have a beer and go see a restaurant. Many people will want to stay in the river and float a quiet part of the river, a more wild part of the river that's not in the city. And they will take out somewhere along the way, or maybe go all the way to Grand Haven. So this assistance will be great, not only for the city, but for the region. Next slide, please. Matt, do you want to take over here? Matt Chapman is my partner in this effort and is also on the phone, I believe.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. I'll try to go quick. I know we're coming up on 10 o'clock here. So just wanted to kind of quickly highlight how this whole project will be implemented and just kind of touch base on exactly where we're at right now in the process. So Steve mentioned this is really kind of will be constructed as two separate projects that'll be permitted separately. The lower reach is roughly from Bridge Street down to Fulton Street. And that's the area that we're actively working through the permitting process right now. The upper reach is essentially then from Bridge Street roughly up to Ann Street, and that's being led by the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. They've contracted with the Army Corps of Engineers, and the city and Whitewater are intimately involved in that process as well. Next slide, please. So the lower stretch design, this is, as Steve kind of discussed, we will replace those 4 low head dams that are between Bridge Street and Fulton Street and replace those with rock and boulder structure to create these riffle and wave features. Next slide, please. There's an image on the lower left there as an example of a wave feature, what one of these might look like in our river system here. This was a wave in Carbondale, Colorado, on the Colorado River. That was very similar to the Grand River at one point, very kind of wide and just kind of flat and pooled up. And you'll see now that much more diversity in the flow. This is a wave that is engineered, that's been designed, that is now attracting visitors from all over the country for things like whitewater paddling, surfing, rafting. Kids when we were there jumped in and floated through in a little rubber ducky. Up on the upper part of the screen there, you see an example of what these riffle features would look like. So you get a sense of that restoring some of that whitewater that is not currently in the river. Next slide. As we go downstream, you'll see some of these wave features kind of progress. I'll pause here just briefly to kind of build on Dale and Stephanie's presentation. The museum's been an incredible partner in this vision, and we did work very closely with them on their redevelopment of that river edge. We wanted to be very careful about getting kids close to the river. So the way that this wave feature is oriented, the way their steps, where they came down, that was all very closely coordinated. We also did propose a little vein structure in the river on the south side of the property that will kind of divert the flow out into the center of the channel and provide kind of a small area, pooled area where those students can get down and touch the river. Next slide. Again, as you head down to Fulton Street, we'll have another wave feature and then some kind of random rock and boulder garden that'll serve a lot of habitat benefits for fish and wildlife and kind of replicate some of the historic boulder rapid conditions. Next slide. As Steve said, and as we've heard with other projects today, that the permitting is the challenge for these large complex projects. And I would kind of echo what's been said earlier, that we are very excited to be kind of out of that design phase and also into the permitting phase. The last 10 years has led us to working through significant design challenges. Obviously, the project that we have flowing through the city, we cannot do anything that creates a flood control problem. We have an invasive sea lamprey problem. We have a federally endangered mussel, fish passage, and then obviously just the way that the model is developed to predict flood conditions, that sort of thing. Very complex, and a lot of the years that have gone into it have gotten us to this point. So now we are working through the actual regulatory permitting process, and as Steve has mentioned, we've had 7 different state and federal agencies that we're working with. They have been at the table for many years, and we've had a lot of conversations with them, and now that we're into the formal processes, there's a bit more back and forth that's taking place, and we're excited to hopefully be starting construction in the river next summer, and I'll touch on that a little bit more in a second. Next slide. So the lower reach permitting milestone, as I said, this is what we're actively permitting. In June of last year, we filed the biological assessment with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That's the document that outlines our conservation measures for the federally endangered and state listed mussel species. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service issued their biological opinion in October of last year that essentially agreed with our conservation efforts that we proposed. We proposed a mitigation fund of about $1.8 million that we will pay into to relocate mussels, as well as to pay to mitigate mussels that cannot be relocated. The Watershed Project Plan is another federal document that we're working with that goes to the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And that's a document that is required to analyze the environmental impacts of the project in order to release $4.1 million of federal funding from the NRCS. So we've received comments back on that document, and that will be resubmitted back to NRCS here shortly. And as Steve mentioned, and I think he's going to jump back in here and kind of discuss a little bit, but in October, we filed the joint permit application to Eagle. And this was our application for the state permit package, or state permits that we need. We received a letter, correction request letter in November from Eagle requesting additional information. We responded back to that, I think, the end of December. And then in early February, we received a second request letter back that identified some additional information, additional resources that we needed to provide. So our project team is, again, actively working on that. We will hopefully anticipate submitting the next response back to that package here shortly. And then that will kind of, again, put the package back in Eagle's court, and we will continue to work with Eagle as they process the application, hoping to work alongside of them to maybe help increase the efficiency and speed up some of the statutory timeframes that they mentioned or that they have for their permitting processes. Steve, do you want to quickly summarize some of the key issues that we're working on this response?
Yeah, let me do that. And by the way, one thing we've not been able to touch because of the constraints of time is that we are working on the equity issue with respect to the river project. Many of you will remember that the city identified this project as a good one to kind of reintroduce some equity notion into contracting, et cetera. And Sierra Atkins has been working with the project, and really the difference, I guess, is that she's been at the table from the beginning, and that issue has been significant all the way through the planning, even on the technical engineering and other things that have gone through. And I know you can and will get reports from her and the city on their work in that regard, but it is worth mentioning. I didn't want to slip that by. So Eagle issues. The second letter Matt referred to had a number of issues in it, things like muscle management, concern about the recreational features, the alternative analysis, or the cumulative impact. And it was frankly kind of a mess, this letter, and we couldn't figure out why, and then finally figured out that they had considered the wrong purpose and alternatives analysis. They considered the one from the grant that Matt mentioned that we're getting from the federal government to improve fish habitat, and not the project overall purpose and alternatives analysis. They said it wasn't a mistake, but that they thought they should be the same, that they shouldn't be inconsistent. But that caused a lot of struggle because the purpose for that grant is solely to do fish habitat. You cannot use that grant for recreation. And so, of course, we adhered to that grant requirement. The overall project, a big part of the project is recreation and creating those whitewater waves. So we're trying to respond to that. And the way that we're going to solve this and get through it, I think, is one of the regulators said to us, we can't require you to present this to us on a silver platter, but if you do, it sure helps. And we are taking great care with this submission to make certain that we've outlined every piece of the law that's applicable, and then shown them exactly where we meet that law. And also, we're very much, working through to make certain that there's nothing that kind of can confuse them. We erred on the side of transparency the first time, and they got 2,000 pages of stuff, and it's our fault and not theirs that was hard for them to work through. It's going to be easier for them to work through this time. Secondly, we are having policy level meetings now. So it's not just the reviewer that's looking at this project, but the reviewer's boss's boss is now involved in meetings with Eric DeLong from the city, myself, and Tammy Newcomb from DNR. Join this Jared Sanders from Eagle, and we meet monthly to talk through these higher level issues and hopefully bring them to resolution. I'm very encouraged by that process and think we'll get there. Matt, why don't you finish up here?
And I think we can jump ahead one more slide, please. So just a real quick update on the Upper Reach project. As I mentioned, that's really being led by the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. They have contracted with the Army Corps of Engineers, who is conducting the environmental impact statement process for the Upper Reach project. That work has been temporarily paused as we are working on the permitting for the Lower Reach. So once the application is submitted and accepted by Eagle, we will see some additional activity going on for the upstream EIS process. So just a reminder, that started actually, we can go to the next slide, please. Started actually in 2019 with the public scoping. The Corps is reviewing 14 different alternatives for a new sea lamprey barrier to be built in the Grand River that replaces the function of the 6th Street Dam. The city and Grand Rapids Whitewater have discussed and proposed this adjustable hydraulic structure, and that is what we refer to as our kind of preferred choice. That structure would be located up above Leonard Street, between Leonard and Ann Street, near the city's water department storage yard. That is the alternative that we believe will provide the most flexibility, allow us to achieve a lot of these other benefits in terms of the river corridor benefits that have been outlined with trail park improvements. It just makes a lot more sense to put that structure upstream farther. The Fishery Commission will be the ultimate decision maker. They will review all the alternatives, and they will choose which alternative is built in the river. That is anticipated to probably happen sometime in 2023 is when that final document will be released. The construction of the new lamprey barrier, whatever is selected, will actually, this slide probably should have been updated, will actually be probably at least 2025 yet, kind of depending on how the process goes. Next slide. Just a quick summary of our funding, then we're just about done here. So again, this has been a tremendous example of how West Michigan comes together. There's a very strong mix of public and private dollars, and it's really a great opportunity to remove these aging and really, frankly, not necessarily dams anymore. Grand Rapids Whitewater has worked closely with the private sector and our local foundation community. We have commitments of over $16 million right now for the project. There's an additional roughly 15 million in state and federal government dollars that have been committed for the project. And then the memorandum of agreement that we mentioned earlier with the the Fishery Commission commits about $19.5 million for the construction of that new sea lamprey barrier with some additional funds to cover some of the sea lamprey control program costs. So in terms of the original estimated $45.5 million budget that we've been working actively to raise funding for the last 3 years, we have happy to report that we have 95% of that funds committed. Now that the world is kind of reemerging, we have start to see some more fundraising efforts take place. Just recently, we received about $2.5 million in new funding commitments again, and we're starting to do some walking tours and getting people back engaged with the river again. So the donor community still continues to be excited about this and about this concept and this idea of new recreation and all that can take place from the efforts to revitalize this entire river corridor. So lastly is just an estimated timeline, and of course the caveat here is obviously this depends on when the permits are processed and approved. We are hopeful that that will start to take place, and that if we get far enough along in the permitting process, we could do some mussel relocation work yet this year. That would have to take place in the fall. And then really we would actively be looking at construction, hopefully, the heavy equipment in the river on the lower reach starting in 2022. So as soon as we can get in the river next summer, that would last until about 2024. Once the lower reach is done, then the construction of the new sea lamprey barrier could begin. That will likely be about a year long, maybe a year and a half long process. And then again, we're advocating and hoping that once the barrier is built, that there's an opportunity to conduct or construct some additional in-river features very similar to what we proposed in the lower reach that will provide some additional habitat and recreation. And then ultimately we hope to see the 6th Street Dam removed as well. So that would be roughly 2026 to 2027, again, depending on which alternative is selected. So I think that is our last slide. Happy to take any questions if we have any, and thanks for the time.
Thanks, Matt. Steve, are there any questions? We're excited
Rick,
for the progress.
I might mention, obviously, text or email me or Matt if you have further questions. I know time was tight, and I apologize for going over.
No, you're fine. Appreciate the presentation and the update. So, any questions at all?
Looks like the mayor has her hand
Mayor,
raised.
yes, I see.
Thanks.
Mayor?
Thanks, Chair. I don't have a question because I'm pretty intricately involved in this project, but I do want to say thanks to everyone involved. This is an extremely complex project with a lot of partners, both at the local level and the state level and the federal level. And the progress we've made, even though at times it feels like we take 2 steps back instead of 2 steps forward, the progress that we've made is pretty incredible. So I just want to thank everyone for their hard work.
Thanks, Mayor. All right, here, if there are no other comments or questions, I don't see any hands raised. Steve, Matt, thanks again. Appreciate the presentation.